Hello everybody and welcome to Sonya Maya Psychology. Today I want to make a tribute video. I'm making a tribute video to remember the very special, world-renowned Dr. Ruth Westheimer, who unfortunately passed about 5 months ago. And I have delayed making this video because I've had a hard time talking about her passing without getting upset. I might get emotional during this video, but that's totally okay because she's been such an inspiration for me. I've also had the amazing opportunity to meet her in my own life, which I'm very, very thankful for. More on that later. But if you like videos on psychology, SMEGS education, and making pleasurable decisions, as I like to call them, then make sure to hit that subscribe, hit that like, and comment down below if you have been inspired by Dr. Ruth at all. She is quite a pioneer, whatever kind of word you want to put on it, iconic, pioneer, world-renowned. She was epic. Some people would refer to her as Grandma Freud. I don't really like that one that much. Or the happy munchkin of sex. I don't know if she liked that either, but it was in her documentary. But she wasn't just a groundbreaking sex therapist. She was a cultural icon who really paved the way for individuals like myself who are sex therapists. I am going to get into her story and how she was an orphan of the Holocaust. I'm going to go through some of the details that I learned from her documentary. By the way, amazing documentary on Hulu. It came out in 2019, I believe, called Ask Dr. Ruth. And I watched it back then, and then I just watched it again in preparation for this video because it really goes into the nitty-gritty of her upbringing and also her incredible journey. A really sad story of losing her family to the Holocaust to becoming this legacy. Let's dive into the remarkable story of Dr. Ruth Westheimer, my mentor, role model. Just love her so much. So how did it all start for this pioneer of sex therapy, media personality, talk show host? Dr. Ruth Westheimer was born as Carola Siegel on June 9th, 1928. She was born in Frankfurt and she was the only child of a family who were Orthodox Jews. Her family cared for her very much. She said that she had everything that she could ever wanted from this family, talking about how important it is to have a nurturing, loving family the first 10 years of your life, and she definitely had that. Fortunately, in 1938, Nazis were taking over. They arrived at her apartment and took her father. Her father was then taken to a labor camp at the time, and he was saying, we need to send our daughter Carola, we need to send you to Switzerland on a kinder transport to make sure that you're safe, because it is not safe to be in Germany. There was no place for Jews when all of this was going on. So her mother and grandmother took her to a kinder transport to Switzerland, and she was only 10 years old. I can only imagine how traumatic that must have been. And a bunch of other Jewish children were sent to an orphanage in Switzerland, and they pretty much were treated like the help. They were doing the housekeeping for the Swiss children at the time. She's at the orphanage. She is taking care of other children and getting letters from her parents. Meanwhile, the woman who's running the orphanage is telling her, oh, your parents sent you here because they don't love you, but she knew that that wasn't true, and she did not like that she would say those things. That's pretty messed up because her parents pretty much were saving her life. They were making sure that she was safe. One of the things that she says in the documentary is that her parents, her family, gave her life twice. Once when she was born, and a second time when they sent her to Switzerland. At this time, she was trying to make the best of it. She would sneak books because Jewish children that were taking care of the Swiss children, learning wasn't a priority. They're like, oh, you're going to live as a helper, pretty much. So she had to sneak knowledge. She was very passionate about learning. Her father would always say, no one can ever take learning from you. So she snuck books about English and geometry, etc. Her father was writing her letters and poetry as well. And about 3 years in to when she was in the orphanage, all of a sudden, the letters stopped. And she was an adolescent at this time. She was 17 years old when the war ended. And the orphanage was reading a list of the names of people, of families who had survived the war. But unfortunately, her family was not listed on there. So she traveled to a kibbutz in Palestine. Germany was very hated where she was. And she was told that she cannot use her actual born name, Carola, anymore. Therefore, she started going by her middle name, Ruth. And so that's, how she became Ruth instead of Carola to be safe. But she wanted to make sure she used her middle name so that her parents could try to find her, hoping that her parents were still alive. Okay, they'll find a Ruth Siegel instead. She ends up finding out much later that unfortunately her father, Julius Siegel, was murdered in Auschwitz in 1942. Her mother, Irma Siegel, on the other hand, completely disappeared, and they don't know what happened to her, which is devastating. And all she has for remembering her family is this washcloth, beautiful washcloth that she shows in the documentary. So in her 20s, she was a sniper for the Haganah in the Israeli army. And she said she would hit the bullseye almost every time, but she never had to shoot anyone. She did get really badly wounded though, and there was an explosion. And she talks about how when she was in recovery, there was this good-looking nurse, and because she found this nurse so good looking, she would tell the nurse like, oh, my hands, I can't use my hands, so that he would feed her 3 times a day because, oh, poor me. But really, her hands were just fine. She just wanted the attention and to be fed from this hot nurse, which I found hilarious. And her game is slick, you know, unlike Johnny Bravo, I mean.
Know what you're thinking. How did the statue get off its pedestal? Well, surprise. I'm real. Sugar nip.
It's like the opposite of Johnny Bravo's Riz, as Gen Z calls it. Dr. Ruth said she knew that New York was her home when she saw the Statue of Liberty because it has this symbolism of hope for refugees, and she's a refugee. So her first husband was a man from the Israeli army. That didn't work out, and she divorced him so she could continue studying. The second marriage was because she got pregnant, but this wasn't someone that she felt like, ooh, this is my person. She divorced this person. She said that she was bored because he was not an intellectual. Dr. Ruth needs those brains, you know? She needs those brains, not just the love affair. She said that her first 2 marriages were legalized love affairs, which I thought was pretty funny. At this time, she was poor, didn't have a lot of money. She was also a single mother. She had a lot of parties. She was very social. And then she met the love of her life, Fred Westheimer. And that's where she got, you know, the Westheimer, of course, from Fred. Fred was the one. He got the brains. She got a position in Harlem, and there were a lot of people asking her sexual health questions at Planned Parenthood, so she wanted further training. And in 1969, she started her doctorate. She actually became a doctor at 42 years old, which is very inspirational, you know? So Dr. Ruth looked up to Helen Kaplan. Helen Kaplan was a famous sex therapist who was a founder of the first clinic in the United States for sexual disorders established at a medical school. Dr. Ruth got accepted into Kaplan's program to train as a sex therapist, worked with her at Cornell for over 7 years, and she was like, I am in heaven. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about my conversation with Dr. Ruth in a bit, but she recommended this book. She wanted me to get this book, The New Sex Therapy, by none other than Helen Singer Kaplan. This was helpful in terms of talking about sexual dysfunctions and how to treat them. So I do recommend this if you are interested in the field. Dr. Ruth then ran her own private practice, working with people with sexual issues, relationship issues. She ended up teaching. And then in 1981, she got a letter from WYNY asking if she could do a special program for sex education. No one was doing this at the time at the radio, okay? And so she ended up hosting Sexually Speaking on WYNY in New York at a time that nobody talks about sex education. They actually did it on, I believe, a Sunday night when they were like, oh, no one's gonna see it anyway. Like, you know, it's okay. It's not gonna be a big deal. They end up blowing up. Kind of like how Eminem was talking about how Dr. Dre wasn't sure what he was doing when he took on Eminem under his wing, and then he lit a fire up under his ass. That's what Dr. Ruth did for WYNY. You know what I'm saying? So it blew up. People are calling in about their sexual issues, about their pain issues, their insecurities, their feelings of shame. And Dr. Ruth was just this amazing, open-minded, very small 4'7" woman, but was giving these people this fresh perspective that destigmatized these topics that nobody talked about back then, really paving the way for talking about sex more comfortably. And I love her for it. I love her for it. Ends up getting a book deal. New York Times wanted a piece of Dr. Ruth. Everyone wanted her on the show. all over the place. There's so many YouTube clips out there of Dr. Ruth just being amazing. Even one with Jerry Seinfeld, which I was like, this is hilarious.
I like people to be married.
What are you hawking me?
I do.
Stop hawking me.
So no one was explicit in the 80s, and she did it anyway. And one of my favorite things that Dr. Ruth says is there's no such thing as normal, because what is normal? We're all normal. No one knows what normal is. I love that. She had the Dr. Ruth show, Good Sex with Dr. Ruth. She had something called Dr. Ruth House. She was an actor. There was even a board game. She just blew up. And like I've said before, the 2019 documentary, Ask Dr. Ruth on Hulu, really good, really good. Laughing, crying, learning. Just love her so much. And something that's so inspiring, she never stopped talking about sex throughout her life, in her 90s even, which is absolutely amazing. And unfortunately, she passed, like I said, 5 months ago at the age of 96, and she will always be remembered. But how do I know Dr. Ruth? So Dr. Ruth was friends with my uncle for over 30 years. Known each other for a long time. I may have met her or at least crossed paths with her when I don't know if I was 8 or 9. I don't remember how old, but I was a flower girl for my aunt and uncle's wedding. And Dr. Ruth was there along with my grandma Ruth, both named Ruth, and they talked. Back then, clearly I didn't know what a sex therapist was or maybe even what sex was. I was like 8. But when I realized in 2019, 2020 that I wanted to become a sex therapist. I was already a therapist. I wanted to specialize in it for other reasons that I've talked about. Happy to make another video on that if you care. I was able to get in touch with Dr. Ruth again. My uncle gave her my number. She calls me up and we have a really amazing conversation about my career and how I can give back and continue what she has started within my career. And that's when she recommended Dr. Kaplan's The New Sex Therapy. She also let me know that there aren't enough psychologists out there or therapists who are sex therapists too. It used to be more of a common thing that someone would just be a sex therapist, but it's really helpful to have both because a lot of psychologists and therapists in general don't specialize. So she was saying, you're doing the right thing, you know, getting your doctorate in psychology and then becoming a sex therapist. And what did I do? This year, I became a sex therapist. So it's only right that I make this video before 2024 ends and also in her memory. Because when I found out that she passed, it really just, it was so hard for me because I wanted more chances to be able to interact with her and just get to know her more. The last time I saw her was in 2021, about a year or so after, where my uncle and I went to go see a play in New York that was literally a one-actress show all about Dr. Ruth, just playing her.
Write me and tell me you've left him.
Thank you, doctor.
Bye-bye. Our show was extended to an hour.
So it was kind of funny because I was watching the show about her life and then I would like look to the left and then Dr. Ruth would be like sitting in her chair like, oh my God, this is so great. And it was so amazing to see that. And then afterwards, when I wanted to go get a picture with my idol, she was like, oh, Sonya, I remember you. You're going to be the sex therapist. She knew exactly who I was. And at that time she was in her, that was 2021. That was 3 years ago. Okay, so she was like 93, 94 at the time and she knew who I was. And I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. And if I haven't made this clear already, I don't know if I would be able to have the job that I have now and be able to talk about these types of things on social media like I do if it wasn't for her paving the way. We don't know what sex education and sexual conversations would be like in America without Dr. Ruth. I don't want to know that world. Anyways, let's talk about 3 of my favorite topics that Dr. Ruth has talked about. So the first thing I love that Dr. Ruth would often talk about in her interviews, regardless of how uncomfortable people looked, because, you know, if they feel uncomfortable, then that's their problem. That's even more reason for her to talk about it, right? Encouraging self-gratification. And she would talk about that on the TV instead of masturbation sometimes. So self-gratification is like a pretty, I guess, kosher way to put it, maybe, possibly. People would often call into her show and By the way, she was getting like 300 to 400 calls, and she would only be able to take like 20 or 25. A lot of them were asking, can I masturbate too much? When is it too much masturbation? She talks about it in such a normalizing way, how there isn't a number, right, of how much masturbation is too much. The way I like to talk about it is if you are in pain or it's impairing your functioning, then yeah, maybe dial it back a bit, right? But there is no special number that's like, oh, this is too much. Like, there's no minimum maximum. That's not how it works. Something that she emphasized up until the end, basically, was how important it is, especially for women vulva owners, to learn how to pleasure and gratify themselves. And then that's how they can show their partner what they like. And she talks about how self-gratification is amazing and healthy among all individuals, older individuals, people who have lost their partners, and of course people who are still married as well. And talking about how people have been told good girls don't touch themselves, but that's not true. And she does a really good job debunking those ridiculous myths that I've definitely talked about on TikTok. But yeah, Dr. Ruth definitely debunked them way in the 80s like this.
But we also know, as a sex therapist and as a sex educator, that I hear many questions. How much masturbation is too much? Because people are very concerned about it because it has never been talked about.
Well, I remember when I was a child, there were myths that everybody has heard, and then they will laugh, you will go blind.
Or hair in the palm of your hand.
Yeah, not all of those things.
You lose your hair.
All of that.
Insane.
If that myth was true, I haven't seen a thing since 1938.
Thankfully, I would imagine that most of us know these things by now, but maybe they didn't back then because it was so much more stigmatized. So thank you, Dr. Ruth, for that. Number 2, I love how Dr. Ruth would talk about how it's okay to fantasize. She gave an example in one of her interviews about how what if a man were to come into therapy or call into the radio show and ask, is it okay if I'm fantasizing about a movie star while I'm with my wife? And she responds, it's perfectly fine, because whatever it takes to get you to that state of arousal, how does she say it? Arousal. I can't even do her voice. It's so cute, but she rolls her R's. Not always their business. You don't have to tell her. Right? If it comes across their mind that they feel this is unfaithful, she would tell people, this is not so. It's not unfaithful. What's in your mind is your business, basically. And number 3, she would talk about how women's pleasure has not been as prioritized, and it's still a problem. She would definitely encourage women to masturbate and their partners to care, And one of my favorite things that she says, because she's super funny and I love this so much, how there's that term coined for men who don't, when they don't get that pleasure, right? Blue balls. But I want to coin a term, blue lips. So I don't know if anybody else talks about blue lips, but I talk about it quite a bit, especially on my TikTok live. But yes, if a woman is not getting the pleasure that she wants, don't give her blue lips. She also encourages talking about sex outside of the bedroom, right? Like, you don't want to do it in the moment, right? Not always, depending on the context. But, outside of the bedroom, saying, hey, that thing that you did, that was really good. Can we do that again? And telling them what felt good. And it's okay to give a critique, but it's in the way that you're expressing it, and the time and place is really important. So I love how Dr. Ruth talked about that, because a lot of people, they just don't know how to navigate these conversations. And lastly, she was very passionate about informing people of the danger of AIDS. When she was blowing up in the 80s and 90s, the AIDS epidemic was a very big deal. It still is a big deal, but when she was in the peak of her popularity, that is when the epidemic was happening. She did a really good job of informing people of the importance of educating and spreading the word and using contraception, using condoms, right? Without pointing the finger at a certain group. She was always very passionate about respecting everybody, especially individuals of the LGBTQ plus community. Everyone deserves that respect, regardless of who they're attracted to. And it's the most important thing is let's find a cure and let's spread awareness and education rather than stigmatizing people. So overall, I think we can all agree here that Dr. Ruth's life really shows how resilient she was and how important it is to have these open conversations. She really did transform the way that we see and talk about intimacy, as I've said before, paving the way for a lot of us sex educators and making it possible to talk about it in an empowering way with passion. As we remember Dr. Ruth today, I want us to remember not only her amazing, cheerful laugh, but the difference that she's made in the world and how much she's cared about people. Even though she went through a terrible trauma, she was able to make the best of her life and continue to learn. And also talk about the importance of gratitude, not taking life for granted, and steering clear of negative people. She talked a lot about that. Taking moments to laugh and to love and prioritize pleasure. So if you want to learn more, she does have over like 40 books. But as I said, the Ask Dr. Ruth documentary on Hulu is amazing. I put some links below in the description for some of her work if you want to check it out. Let's definitely keep her teachings alive, and I will continue to educate the public about sex and keep these sexual conversations going in her memory. And I think I might have been able to get through this whole video without crying, which is surprising to me. But if I did cry, that would be okay, because there's nothing wrong with some tears. But man, yeah, we definitely had a loss this year. So rest in peace and in pleasure, Dr. Ruth. And let me know below, did Dr. Ruth impact your life in a significant way? I would love to hear your thoughts as we continue to grieve and also remember her for how amazing that she was. And everyone, continue making pleasurable decisions and decisions. And if you've watched until the end of the video, thank you. That helps me so much. There will be a lot more videos in 2025. I'm still working on a very big, important life goal. So I do apologize that I haven't been as active on YouTube, but that is going to change in the new year. So please stick around and like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next Sonya Maya Psychology video. Bye.